So, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Princeton Public Library. I'm Janie Herman, Manager of Adult Programming. It's my great pleasure to introduce our author and moderator for the program this evening, which is first of our, what we call LLL series here in Princeton for 2024. So, LLL is when the library and Labyrinth get together, and sometimes the library is at the store with our author, and then it's Labyrinth live at the library, and tonight it's the library and Labyrinth live at the library. So we just connected, it's L's. And during the pandemic, it was the library and Labyrinth live stream. It all works out. But basically, the library and Labyrinth, we like to plan our events together as much as possible to take advantage of the collective power of bringing our book community together, both through an independent bookstore and a library. So please note this room is equipped with a hearing loop, and it pairs with T-coil technology. We also have headphones available for your convenience. They are over on the piano, so if you need assistance, just let us know. We'll bring a pair to you. We ask that you silence electronic devices and hold your questions until it's time for the audience question and answer at the end of the presentation. And so, as I said, this is an LLL series, but always Labyrinth Books is here as our bookseller. And I want to extend thanks to Princeton University Press for their ongoing support not only of this event, but for many, many events here in our community room. We are so grateful for their support. In addition, we owe thanks to the Princeton Neuroscience Institute for co-sponsoring tonight's talk. A book signing will take place immediately following the program. So tonight's event, we will be exploring the topic of aging, something that none of us can avoid and all of us hope to navigate successfully. So we are thrilled to be able to welcome two Princeton University faculty members to the library for this event tonight to discuss this important topic. Coleen T. Murphy is Professor of Genomics and Molecular Biology at Princeton. She is Director of Princeton Glenn Foundation for Research on Aging and Director of the Simons Collaboration on Plasticity in the Aging Brain. Her research lab is focused on the process of aging, which remains one of the fundamental mysteries of biology. Her recently published book by Princeton University Press, How We Age, The Science of Longevity, will be the focus of the discussion tonight. And she is joined by Sam Wang, who will be to discuss it and is a professor of molecular biology and neuroscience at Princeton. His laboratory research focuses on learning from birth to adulthood at levels ranging from single synapses to the whole brain. He is the author of two books about the brain. The first one is Welcome to Your Brain, Why You Lose Your Car Keys But Never Forget How to Drive, and Other Puzzles of Everyday Life, as well as Welcome to Your Child's Brain, How the Mind Grows from Conception to College. So please join us in welcoming Coleen T. Murphy and Sam Wang to discuss our brains.
Okay, thank you for that lovely introduction. How's the levels there? All right, thank you for that lovely introduction. I'm Sam Wang, and I am delighted and honored to, got that little ringing there. We'll get that fixed probably in a second. I am delighted and honored to be here to have a conversation with my colleague and friend, Coleen Murphy, about her new book, How We Age, The Science of Longevity, which is available wherever good books are sold. And Coleen, of course, is my colleague, and she's the director of the Louis Sigler Institute for Integrative Genomics here at the university on campus across the way. And if you drive down Washington Road, you can see the building that she stewards. Coleen, it's really terrific to have you here at the library tonight.
Thanks, Sam.
So let's just go ahead and get right into it. I think we've got some time for a conversation about your new book, and hopefully we'll get into questions pretty soon. So let's just start very generally. Here we have a book about aging. You are a world authority in aging research, and you spend all your time doing research, or a lot of your time. Why did you take time to write this book? What happened?
Right, so I think what Sam's referring to is usually when we do a lot of research, unlike a lot of fields, a book is not necessarily one of the things that we are expected to do. So Sam's actually unusual in this regard as well. So I taught a class at Princeton University, and the class was really about my passion. This is the idea of we should try to understand the genetic and cellular basis of aging. And the reason for that is if we can understand that, maybe we could slow the onset of aging, or actually really slow the onset of a lot of age-related diseases. Because really there's nothing wrong with aging. It's just a lot of inconvenient things that come along with it that would be nice to slow down. And so I was teaching this class, and it gave me an opportunity to really not only talk about my lab's research, but of course that's just one small facet of the whole field, to really understand what was going on in the entire field. And so I would, the students and I would go through this and made me really appreciate everything that a lot of people were doing. And then I realized that there's this gulf between what we understand as a field and even what my students understood by the end of this course, and what often gets out to the lay public about what's going on in the aging field. There are a lot of very popular books about longevity, and I felt that there were a lot of gaps to be filled in that area. For example, a lot of those are about one person's view of what they might have discovered, and maybe along with that a supplement that they want to sell you. And so I was not really interested in that perspective. I really wanted to say a skeptic's view of a lot of the things. So, for example, there are a lot of things being sold right now being considered like anti-aging. And I really think that we're in an exciting time. We're about to get to something that could be really helpful, but I'm not sure that there's anything necessarily right now that I would market as that. And so the problem is most people don't have enough of the research background to be skeptics about that. And I wanted to be able to convey what do we know and what do we not know yet, so that people can make wise decisions for themselves.
That's terrific. I have to say, when one goes to the bookstore, one can, or wherever one goes instead of going to a bookstore, that there are a lot of books that appear to be about aging. And there are things from like dietary supplements, there are books about longevity, there's books about all kinds of things. So let's just zoom out a little bit and say, like, in the scope of what you wrote about, can we just talk about what aging is?
Sure. Okay.
I mean, really, what is aging?
Right. Not to use that oft-quoted Supreme Court situation where you know when you see it. But there's that aspect. We all have an intuitive understanding of what aging is, but then translating that into something where we understand really at the cellular level what that is very different from just saying, oh, I can see it. Although there's some really interesting things, like all of us can basically guess a person's age from seeing their face, seeing how they walk. There's a lot of interesting information that we've learned over time just by knowing, how old someone is and how they behave. And it turns out you can use those as diagnostics as well. So for example, Jackie Jing Dong Han in Beijing, she was using 3D facial reconstruction, 3D facial analysis to develop ways to understand not only aging, but also could you take an intervention and would it be measurable? And that was really cool because it turned out that was even better than the current blood tests that exist right now. And so those are the kinds of things where that's a technology that we're on the verge of. And so, if you look around and you see people, you kind of know how old they are because of not artificial intelligence, but your own intelligence, your own learning, right? We've all learned how people age.
I mean, that's really striking to me. Like, there are things like, you look at people's faces, like you say, I don't know, backs of people's hands, all kinds of things. And I know from your research and from others that other animals age too. So there's something universal going on there.
Right.
And in your own research, you work on an organism that seems really different from humans, right? These small worms, C. elegans. And I wanted to hear about the universalities. Like, what is it about? What are the shared features of how a 3-week organism ages and how an 80-year person ages?
Right, so what Sam's referring to is the organism we work with is called C. elegans. It's a tiny little nematode. It's about the size, you can see it on a plate, it looks like lint, unless you have a microscope. But if you do have a microscope, you can actually watch how these animals age. So they live about 3 weeks, and in that time, they really obviously age. And if I gave any of you a picture of a young worm and an old worm, you'd be able to tell the difference. And it turns out they don't just change it turns out they actually get fat and wrinkly. So that's too close to home. And they slow down. And one of the fun things that my lab does is when we want to understand, we ask ourselves, is there something about aging that we care deeply about? And can we develop an assay, a test, an experiment that we can do on C. elegans that will actually not only mimic that, but then, and my lab's gotten so good at this, we can actually then pinpoint the exact same genetic mechanisms. So we've done this not just for movement, and it turns out you can track, if you track across 30 seconds of a little worm moving and you get their maximum speed. So it's basically like if you were watching people, but then those people had to sprint a little bit. If you do that for every worm, that declines with age. And you can do this for memory. So my lab developed assays to study learning and memory, and that declines really quickly in these animals. And it turns out it uses the exact same genetic mechanisms, which seems really surprising, right? Because we think these animals out in the wild, they live in the dirt, like they must have very different neuronal function. But in fact, they use, like it turns out a neuron needs at its very basic core to act like a neuron across all different systems. And so if you keep that neuron functioning longer with age, we can actually, in fact my lab we use that same mechanism in an old mouse and we were able to boost its memory. So just by learning what a worm does. So that's one of our favorite things to do.
And can you make a worm live longer?
Right, so the reason that Sam's prompting because like the most important reason that we work on this animal is not only because it ages rapidly, but because in 1993, Cynthia Kenyon, when she was a professor at UCSF, she revealed that a single gene mutation in what turned out to be the insulin receptor, so the same gene that we have, single mutation in that gene actually doubled the lifespan of the animals. And it didn't just drag out the amount of time that they're sick, it actually doubled the time that they're really healthy. And it turned out that same mutation makes the animals sprint faster, longer, it improves their memory, and it even allows them to maintain like their reproductive function longer. So this is really a good model for, I think, most of the things that we want to do better in our lives.
Is there a relationship between, I don't know, reproducing in 30s and 20s through 40s and living to 80 or up?
Yeah. So there was a very cool study by Tom Pearls, and he used a totally different approach from what we do, which is he looked retrospectively. So he took health records from women in Boston in the 1800s and was able to track when they have centenarians and then figure out how late they had children. And it turns out the centenarians were more likely than anyone to have been able to naturally, of course there was no artificial reproductive technologies, they were more likely to have had kids in their 40s. And the women who lived over 95 were more likely to have had kids over the age of 33. And so this kind of information tells you not that you should try to live longer by having kids late, but instead that it's kind of a biomarker already. So women who can naturally do this are probably, genetically or cellularly destined to go on to live a long lifespan.
So there's something about having kids later or being able to that also leads to being able to live a very long time.
They're probably related systemically, probably because the same reason like these long-lived worms change their entire insulin signaling system and do all these things, that it probably has something to do with that as well, just these sort of systemic changes.
And we haven't talked about the molecular to cell biology at all. Are these molecules that, what do they do? Do they fix DNA? Do they, what are the major things that are busy at work? Mm-hmm. I don't know, I'm getting the idea that they're keeping us from aging.
That's right. So the insulin signaling system is, and there are a couple of systems like this, but I'll talk mostly about that. The insulin signaling system, so you can think of it as when it's turned down, it's a little bit like telling the body that it's already deprived of food, okay? And so what it does then is it turns on a transcription factor that boosts all these kinds of repair mechanisms. And it's not just one thing. And this is why I think it's funny when you talk about these books about aging, they all usually focus on one thing, but this one pathway sort of branches out and it fixes all the proteins in the cell, and it turns on ways to recycle broken things. And so it basically does all these things in parallel. And I really like the way Cynthia described it as being like the conductor of an orchestra. So if you think of the orchestra as everything in the cell that could be doing something to fix itself, that pathway, the insulin signaling receptor, insulin signaling system and the transcription factor it regulates, that's the conductor. And so you get all these things that repair at the same time by just fixing this one gene.
And so this conductor, after a certain age, the conductor retires or something? I mean, what happens, what's going on there?
Yeah, so that's a good question. One of the things I think is a little bit lacking in the field, because we really like to do the genetics and figure out what the mechanisms are, and often that's done in young animals, okay? And so what's really important, when I review papers, for example, really encourage people to do these tests in older animals, right? Because it doesn't matter if you fix everything young. If we think about what we want to do for people, right? If it turns out you have to take a drug when you're 25 in order to do anything later, it's going to be useless to us, right? What we really want to do is when we start feeling like we are aging, then, start taking a drug then that could help us. And so figuring out whether these pathways are still at work when we're old or not is important. Now, some of the repair mechanisms themselves do decline with age. So for example, we talk about like autophagy. So this is self-eating. So basically that's a repair mechanism where the cells turn on, they engulf all the broken stuff, the damaged proteins, and they recycle it. So, but with time, of course, that system breaks down. But if you can think about it, each one of those systems I told you about, the repairs things, they also break down. So if all that is happening, it's really hard to keep things going. So what we really like to do is to figure out ways to boost all those activities at once. So even if there's only a little bit left, it will work better.
So we've got our bodies and our cells have this toolkit for keeping things from breaking. All these tools are at work. Okay, so I'll ask the opposite question. Why do the tools go away?
So there's evolutionary pressure. So basically, every animal on this earth evolved to do one thing, essentially to make more of itself, right? And so after that part is done, after reproduction is done, there's very little evolutionary pressure to keep it going, right? So we're lucky in humans, right, that instead, and actually a really good question, why do we live so long? Why do we have such a long post-reproductive lifespan? And there's lots of sociology theories about that, like the grandmother hypothesis. Well, the weird thing is that C. elegans does the exact same thing. So even though grandmothers are important.
Worms don't care about anatomist or whatever.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So we figured out that actually what happens is, really what they're doing is they're bet hedging. They're trying to make the best possible case for themselves by saying, okay, this is nice, I'm going to reproduce this long. But what if it turns out right in the middle of reproduction, I run out of food? What do I do then? So that's when it's really good to slow things down, turn all those repair mechanisms, stretch it out so that you can keep reproducing when food appears again, okay? Those pathways are all conserved in us as well. We just don't know quite how to tweak all of them to make them like extend.
Okay, so we get older, we've got a toolbox of like hammers and screwdrivers and stuff to fix cells, and then like, at age 40, the hammer leaves. And at age 50, the screwdriver leaves. And then eventually, we're baggy.
And you
whatever.
can't see anymore.
Yeah. Now, you said something about the reproductive aging versus old age thing, where you said although these two things are correlated, having the age of having kids and the longevity correlate, and you said having kids later isn't going to help. So I want to ask you about something that I see in the news all the time. You got a whole chapter in your book about this. Centenarians, right? People live to 100, and then we ask them, what'd you do? They say, I smoke cigars every day. So what can we learn from these cigar smoking, martini swilling centenarians?
That they were very lucky.
Okay, right.
Yeah, centenarians, it's really amazing to read their stories. Almost none of the centenarians, at least in recent history, have done anything special to live. There's one guy, he's a cyclist in France, Robert Marchand. But everyone else is like the opposite, does exactly the opposite of what the rest of us should do to live long. So I don't think that they're advice, and it's an N of one, right? They're like telling what they did. They drink some Johnny Walker every day at noon or whatever. So like they are basically genetic superheroes, and it doesn't matter what they do because it still doesn't. And you look actually at the rest of their genomes. This has been done now. And there's all kinds of things that are messed up. So it's just they have gotten lucky with one or two things that are
So it's
good.
like these planes that come back from war. There's this famous study where the planes come back and the wings are shot up and the engines are not. And it turns out actually what that teaches you is that the engines are the things that are vulnerable. So okay, so we can't learn from centenarians. We can't wait till 40 or 50 to have, or whatever, to have kids. So is there an intervention that is actually helpful?
Yeah. So
I saw a book that said it's all about what you eat.
yeah. Okay. So there's lots of studies, and I have a chapter in the book about dietary restriction because the truth is a lot of people really do love doing that. I think that's a fascinating psychological study to understand who really loves doing dietary restriction and who doesn't. In fact, there's a group of people called the cronies who are voluntarily calorically restricting themselves to live longer, not for any other purpose. And the ratio of men to women is 29-1. So this is not an intervention that I am personally interested in. I like to eat. But it is worth knowing how it works, right? Because if you could develop a drug that tricks your body into thinking that you've turned on caloric restriction, it would be awesome, right? So it's useful to study, but I'm not convinced that that's like something I want to do. And also the people, and there's lots of interesting studies about, if you actually do the controls, for example, for what's called time-restricted feeding or time-restricted eating. There was a guy at UCSF who was so convinced this would be a great thing to do that he was doing it for himself personally for like 7 years, and then he started a really careful study on this. What he discovered was that, in fact, it didn't matter. Because when he did the proper control, which is that just having the control group just keep track of what they ate every day, there was zero difference. And in fact, the people who had done the time-restricted eating, they actually lost lean muscle mass. And so I think that the problem is people are really excited about dietary restriction, are so excited that they neglect to tell you the downside. And so the interventions that I think, in addition to like a lot of the drugs that are being developed now, but they don't exist, they're not on the market yet, exercise. I think you can't lose with exercise. There's basically nothing, see some cheering. It's hard to imagine a better way to make sure that you're at least feeling better than exercising, and it does wonderful things, not only for all the things we care about for living long, but as you've talked about, for your brain, for making your brain work better.
So I'm just making sure I get this straight. Dietary interventions mostly don't work, or they're ineffective. Exercise is an intervention that in fact improves quality of life.
That's right.
Okay. But I mean, before this event, you and I were talking about other things like downregulating reactive oxygen species and other things. So there's all kinds of things that we read about that are supposed to be good for aging. Are any of them perchance counterproductive?
Yeah, so there was a nice study, again, by someone who was very excited about dampening reactive oxygen species by using, like, to be fair, like a ton of antioxidants, so a huge amount of vitamin C and vitamin E in the study where they took young men, so that not aging, young men that were exercising. They had young men on an exercise program, and then one group got a ton of these antioxidants, and they were really expecting them to do better. It turns out they didn't show any benefits of exercise. It erased all benefits of exercise. And it turns out that's because you need reactive oxygen species as a signal. So your body, when it generates reactive oxygen species, it tells the rest of your body, oh, we got a little bit of emergency to deal with, and it turns on systems that are protective. And so a little bit of antioxidant is probably okay, but a ton is probably really bad. And I think we don't quite understand all the things that these molecules do, and the signaling aspects of reactive oxygen species is less well studied than the damaging part of it.
It makes me think of how if you're a jock and you take ibuprofen to prevent yourself from feeling bad about that, then you can injure yourself. And it just gives me that same vibe that if you deprive your body of a signal that says, time to fix the DNA. So I'm trying to piece together a few different things here. And one thing I'm struck by is that, and I saw this in a review of one of the reviews in your book. By the way, if anyone has access to Nature magazine, there's a really terrific review that Dame, what's her name?
Linda Partridge.
Yeah, Partridge. Dame Partridge wrote about Coleen's book. Really excellent review. But one thing I'm really struck by is that there was another reviewer who maybe skipped a chapter, and I want to ask you about the difference between aging, and then here we have all these, like, I don't know, you're giving me the idea of the tech bros who don't ever want to get old and they're worried about the aging end. But you, in your book, you write about life expectancy versus aging, and I wonder if we could just talk about that. It gets a little bit beyond the biology, but you went there, and I want to hear your thoughts about what's the difference.
Yeah, so because there's so much focus, and especially like some tech bros, on living as long as possible by any means necessary, and it's really kind of disturbing. I want to say aging, it's a privilege to be able to age, right? There's so many other ways to die young, and it's really, we're lucky if we get to consider aging as a problem. And there are a lot of people in this world, in this country, who don't have all the benefits. You know, Princeton is a great place, right? People are gonna live a long time here because you can walk, there's high socioeconomics, right? That people have good access to healthcare. And when we talk about aging as a country and life expectancy as a country, is not constant. There's not everyone has access to the same healthcare, even the same groceries, right? Like food deserts, food apartheid. So people who are not getting access to healthy food, it makes sense. Or they're working on. We know that chronic stress, and we know that working weird hours, like working night shifts. Those are all where you take hits on life expectancy. And so, you know, it's sad to say, but the one way to guarantee you'll live as long as possible is to be white, to be rich, and to be a man. So, or to be a single woman. So that's it. So we have to, if we're really interested in the country as raising life expectancy, the last thing we need to worry about is like eking out the last like 10 years of life by taking some drugs. We really need to make sure that all kids get, you know, all their vaccines. Actually, frankly, everyone get their vaccines. Everybody get good access to preventative health care, right? So even things like Alzheimer's disease, where certain groups, so African Americans and Hispanics actually are diagnosed with Alzheimer's much later, at a later stage than other groups. And so, you know, we're not doing the best to help everyone live their best life. And so that's something I think, as in the field of aging, I think it's ignored all the time when we go do research talks at conferences. There's this idea that everybody's already living to their maximum potential, and that's not true.
Well, people in the research business are in fact in a privileged category where
Absolutely.
they usually have good access to healthcare.
That's right.
This is all making me think of work done by our colleagues Ann Case and Angus Deaton about deaths of despair and all these other things that basically take us down on this path, and then the tech bros are at the end, you know.
That's right.
Human growth hormone or whatever.
Or everything that Brian Young, or whatever that guy's name is.
Yeah, okay, we were not gonna, okay, one thing we agreed beforehand, we were not gonna talk about other people's books.
Oh, no. No, that's not, no, somebody in the audience probably knows the guy I'm talking about. The guy who's a billionaire who's spending all of his money to live long, including by taking blood from his teenage son.
Oh, yeah.
What is his name, Brian Johnson? I don't know.
Does that work?
No, I mean, he's 45 and looks like a well-preserved 44-year-old.
Well, what about the stuff like about sewing mice together and all that? Like, I thought there were factors.
Yes, okay. So that is a legitimate field. So there's parabiosis. Okay. So, and in fact, actually, the exercise thing, it comes into play. So there were very cool studies where if you take, it's called heterochronic, meaning 2 different ages, parabiosis. So 2 different animals, mice of 2 different ages are stitched together, so they end up sharing a circulatory system. All right. It's weird. They actually apparently don't mind this. It's very strange. And after a couple of weeks,
they just walk around.
yeah, it's like a 3-legged race.
So it's not like this, like they're in circles.
Presumably.
Okay.
So, it was funny because the first papers were done on this were all looking at how much worse the young mice did. But the truth is that the old mice did much better. And so you can imagine there's all these ideas of vampirism and taking young blood. But it is true that there are factors in young blood that are good. They're induce repair. And there's factors in old blood that are negative. And so, and in fact, even if you take the animals of the same age, where one is exercised and the other one hasn't, the one that hasn't actually gets cognitive benefits. Yeah, so Solvate at UCSF has done that work and figured out some of the factors, and actually it's a liver factor. So when you exercise, you do things to your metabolism that changes things in your liver, and then it sends out things into your bloodstream that then affect your brain.
So I could sew myself to someone who exercises
There you
more
go.
than I do.
Yeah, there you go, blood boy.
Now, there's a lot of focus, and I want to get into a little bit closer to my own domain of neuroscience. People get into aging research, but if you look at NIH's priorities, it's stuff like Alzheimer's. So what's missing in this picture in aging research?
Right, so there's a huge amount of funding for Alzheimer's, which is great, but there's almost no funding just for normal cognitive aging. And that's very bizarre because almost everyone who, again, is privileged enough to live long enough will suffer from some sort of problems with cognitive function. And so I was invited to become the director of the Simons Collaboration on Plasticity in the Aging Brain because I care about this very deeply. And the idea is, could we learn more about normal cognitive aging that could benefit more people, and actually might also benefit Alzheimer's patients depending on how it works. And so what we did with that was we brought together lots of researchers who study aging and research and had never done any neuroscience before, and a lot of neuroscientists who had never done any aging work before. And that's interesting because it's really two different cultures, and even getting them to discuss, like, use the right time points, like what the aging field thinks is an old mouse is like a year older than what a neuroscientist thinks is an old mouse. And that's because behaviors change so quickly. So anyway, that's been great because in the past 4 years, we've been able to bring about, I think it's up to like 31 research teams that are working specifically on cognitive aging and working together with one another to do things that probably never would have been done before. And I'm really hopeful that we'll be able to crack this because it seems like there's some very important things that we could do that could benefit everyone as we age to help not just keep our bodies young, but actually keep our brains functioning longer, which I think is really super important.
Outstanding. Now, you wrote the book. We are in this field of research, biomedical research, where things happen after we write our articles and books. So are there things that are not in the book, things you're excited about on the horizon that there wasn't enough evidence for you to put in the book?
Yeah. Actually, it turns out I did write a little bit about these GLP-1, I guess, which you guys have all heard about, Ozempic, right? Yeah. So I put a little bit of that in the book because it turns out liraglutide is actually a diabetes treatment. And but even when I wrote it, because I wrote it like 3 years ago, I didn't anticipate how big a deal it would be. And not because of celebrities trying to get too thin, but mostly because I think actually these are going to be some of the, when I talk about life expectancy, so one of the things that kills Americans first are cardiovascular disease. And it seems really clear that some of these GLP-1 peptides, they're going to actually help people lower their weight and actually improve their cardiovascular function, and they're going to live longer than they would have. And so in some ways, that's actually could be one of the first, in addition to, I think, statins are sort of in this category of things that we don't think of as a longevity drug, but in fact, they're helping people live longer. So not everything that's going to be like, this is going to magically make you live longer. It's going to be something where actually we're solving a medical problem, and it's one of the first things that we die of. And so if we like move that needle, then we'll actually all start living longer.
And will this help quality of life then as well?
I'm certain of it because I think also like exercise for a lot of people is difficult to do. And I have one more thing to say about exercise. I think when people lose weight, they're more likely to exercise and become more active. So I think that together actually will be useful. I don't have stock in this stuff, but maybe I should.
Well, I am struck by the fact that there are certain things that you're quite a leader in, and you did really go beyond that when writing this. And this is kind of circles back all the way to the beginning of the conversation, where there are things that are specifically you're extremely well published in, but you chose to write a book that went all the way into quality of life, into these different pathways, some of which you have and have not worked on.
Yeah.
That struck me.
Thank you. I also think I didn't write much about immunology and aging, and then mostly because of my ignorance in that area, but I think it's important, and I think if I were to revise this, I'd probably add something about that, because I think actually we're seeing, for example, the new tools that are being used to treat cancer using immunotherapy. So that's another area that I would probably add to it.
Did you say that you finished writing this book 3 years ago? Or there was parts of your...
No, parts. Because I taught it over a class and then I added parts, so yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the rate of publication. So,
it's not a publication.
No, I mean like
right.
scientific publication.
Yeah. Oh.
Like things come out and like we write a thing and it's like, I gotta say my first book, like there's stuff in there that I kind of don't believe anymore. Like most of it is okay, but like there's just one or two things I just think, yeah, that one thing it's not true anymore. And so I worry about that with scientific books, that one has to...
I don't worry about that so much as just sort of things I've missed because they didn't exist before the book came out. So there's always going to be new stuff to add. The thing about the blood factors, that's sort of just taking off, like really understanding all the different parts that we have, because the tools and technology for things like mass spec have gotten so much better for accounting for all the proteins. I don't know, there's always going to be something new. Someone's going to come out with something.
Are there things you've learned about because people corresponded with you, or like you is there anything really that either you learned while writing this book, or that someone wrote to you and said, hey, you should, did you think about this? Is there anything that has surprised you? Or that you think about more now that, okay, let me put it another way. Is there stuff you think about more than before you started writing this book? Because you turned your expertise in this book and you had to turn it into something of general interest. So are there things that you think about differently now that you went through this?
I do think the social disparities in lifespan bother me more probably than ever before, because you can really see that. There's probably other things escaping me, but a lot of this grew out of teaching the class. So really, there was the teaching the class that opened up my eyes to some new areas. One of the fun things that's always developing, we use some of this, what's called standard model systems, and so those are things like C. elegans, which we mentioned, or Drosophila, mice. But one of the really great things that's happened because of CRISPR, so that's something you guys have probably all heard of as a way to change the DNA and really engineer things. And so that's allowed people to take animals that are great for answering a specific question and turn it into a genetic model organism that was never possible before. So now we're seeing something like, marmosets, so small primates, so close to us, but that actually, have they don't have the huge lifespan that rhesus macaques have. They live over 35 years. That's too long to do an experiment, right? But if you can use a shorter-lived primate, but they still have, cognitive function much like humans, then that really is going to allow us to do a lot of great things. And I'm not going to do that. I have no patience, so 3 weeks is good for my labs. We experiments. But someone working on, short-lived primates could really make a huge impact.
Working with mammals is both rewarding and annoying for various reasons.
Yeah.
Time is one of the factors.
Exactly.
Like a generation time of 2 weeks. My reaction is, that's amazing.
Yeah.
Tell you what, this has been super interesting, but I think that maybe people have questions. So if you're up for it, let's maybe turn to the audience and see if there are questions. And I think, let's see, what's our plan? You're going to go around with the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, so the microphone comes to you, and then you get to ask a question. We'll try to go around as much as possible.
There's a lot of value in thinking quickly, retrieving information, making connections, and producing information. Okay, there's a lot of emphasis in human functioning among younger generations in responding quickly, making connections, retrieving information, and applying it. The aging process slows that down, obviously, and the continuum of dementia, one of the markers is not retrieving, not remembering. Can you comment on that? What kind of work is being done specifically on that, particularly retrieval and speed of thought?
My specifics are going to be not specific, very vague. There's like I said, we're very interested as a large group through the Science Collaboration. There's other people working on that specific field, but this idea that how that changes with age, I think there's, people are working on that. What we're trying to do is connect, actually, because there's lots of neuroscience that can be done, but if it's separated from genetics usually. And from the genetic side, we're usually not working with, really what the genetics is helpful because it gets us to molecules quickly that then hopefully we'll get to therapeutics. So what we really want to do is bring the fields together, because I think neuroscientists do an excellent job of really understanding these problems in detail. And the question is, can we marry these two together so we can actually solve some of those problems? I think mostly with small molecules and drugs.
Well, one thing about your point is that we often get really interested in brain training exercises like Lumosity and so on. A former student of mine started Lumosity. I liked him, but anyway. But these brain training exercises often don't make us better or smarter or improve our memory. There is one exception, which is that brain training to improve reaction time does help with reaction time. and it's the sole exception that I'm aware of for brain training exercises. So it's not exactly retrieval, but a quickness that we notice that our quickness declines as we get older. And that quickness can perhaps be restored, and that could be important for things like, I don't know, driving safety. And so I think the one thing that one could do is reaction time exercises.
I have a question for Sam. What is in your first book that you don't think is true anymore?
What's in my first book? I shut off my mouth, like it's important when you're a conversationalist to talk about other people and not about yourself, and like I broke rule 1. Some of the stuff about willpower being a finite resource, like there's been a real problem that's arisen in social psychology, which is, if you look it up in the scholarly literature, it's called the replication crisis. And there's just things that seemed really convincing that have not necessarily replicated just because the conditions weren't just right. And one of the ones is that willpower is a finite resource, and it turns out that there's some evidence for that, but it's not as universal an idea as was originally thought. And I feel bad about that because that seemed like a really important insight, but I think one would need to keep up. I think there's been a lot of really good work done in social psych to go over all the classic findings over the last 20 years and figure out which things are still true. But I do, and another one is differences between men and women in object rotation, like is this and this the same object? And men are supposed to be better at that. But those differences turn out to be smaller when women are cued with an appropriate problem that, for whatever reason, they care more about, at which point those gender differences seem to diminish. So there are things like that that I feel a little bit less secure about. Other things are okay. A lot of the book is okay. The book's mostly okay.
I've been asked on behalf of a friend, can you tell us the 1, 2, and 3 things you could do to live a little bit longer and a little bit better?
Okay, so most of the book is about what's coming, and it's not really a how-to. In fact, one of the comments on, like, I think Amazon reviews was, it's not how to live longer, it's how we age. They were looking for the answer.
It's now how not to age.
Yeah,
it's how we
exactly.
age.
So I'm not really, so I will say again, that exercise I think is probably the best thing that anyone can do, just for quality of life. And I think, as I mentioned, like, people are obese, they probably should lose weight. I think that, and again, be lucky and be rich and get good health care.
Lucky, rich, and exercise.
Yeah, so, yeah, if you're really lucky, you're a centenarian, it doesn't matter what you do. But you won't know that until it's too late.
But with typical genetic inheritance and exercise.
Is walking enough of exercise, or does it have to be rigorous exercise?
I'm not going to go into that. I think that probably is. I'm not going to like get into prescriptive types of.
Yeah, negotiation is probably not the.
Yeah.
My octogenarian mother lately has been on a kick about taking dietary supplements that address cellular senescence. And I believe at the beginning you addressed a bit about senescent cells that become less than optimal and maybe don't work as well as they used to as we age. Things like quercetin and fisetin, I think she mentioned. Can you speak to if those are effective and I should listen to my mother?
Well, so I'm not an MD, so I'm not going to say whether they are effective because there are studies, there are academic studies showing that they do eliminate senescent cells. Now, whether that is enough to make you live longer, that's not been shown. In fact, a company called, I think, Unity started out with that idea that they would sell various senolytics. But there's a weird thing in the aging field, right? Because it's not considered by the FDA to be a disease. It means that you can't, at this point, get FDA approval for anti-aging drugs. So if you've read that something's an anti-aging drug, it means that it's not because the FDA has told you that. It's because the marketing says that, okay? And it might be based on research. Okay, having said that, there's a trial for metformin right now because it's been noticed that people are taking metformin for other things, actually for people who are on metformin for diabetes actually did better, not only than other diabetics, but other people who weren't on metformin. So the idea that Nir Barzilai and Einstein has is, can we use this as a test case, a large clinical trial, to convince the FDA that we should make aging something that we should test for, so that then products can really be tested for that, right? Because right now, you don't know. You don't even know what's in your, by the way, when you take capsules, I was at a conference this year in Denmark, and at this meeting, they showed some shocking studies that because these things are not checked, they did mass spec on all these capsules of stuff, and it was just random. Like, some things were actually what they said they were, and some things weren't, okay? And so when we get chemicals to do our tests on, those have been shown that they're correct, but I don't know, you don't know what's in this. This is why I really hope that Nir Barzilai and others are successful in their attempts to get the FDA on board, because it would be really nice to know as a consumer that you're getting something that's real and that actually works. Now, as far as Senolytics go, there's actually a more interesting thing I think that Senolytics will be useful for. So it turns out that kids who have had cancer actually end up having a lot of problems later in life. They cured of the cancer because they incurred a lot of damage from the radiation treatments and other things. They actually have a lot of health problems, even in young middle age. And so it turns out that some of these Senolytics actually do help with that. So that encouraged me, and I think that's another aspect I really would like to mention, that work in the aging field is not just good for helping people live longer who are already maxing out their lifespan, but in some cases might be really helpful for people who really need help earlier in life. The other cases, for example, issues with people who need help with their muscles. For example, not everybody can exercise, and it's not because they're not trying hard, but they actually have physical limitations. And so there are some drugs that actually can help with muscle function. Those have been abused a lot by Russian Olympians, but they actually can help normal people or people with muscle problems actually perform better. And so sort of these, not really, but these offshoots of aging research that could be beneficial for them. So thank you for this Senolytic question, because I think that could be really useful for another group of people as well.
Okay, other questions?
I think there's maybe one in front, and then there might be another one back, and then.
A number of years ago, maybe 20 or more, Psychology Today had an article in which they had people of different ages, from middle age to older age, and they asked them how old they felt they were. And then in the audience, they had doctors and nurses, and then they asked them to judge how old these people were. And it turned out they were more accurate. They weren't accurate on the chronological age. They were accurate on how people felt about themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any molecular or genetic or anything, studies on, this kind of social versus biological connection?
I can't speak to the social connection, but you're asking about there's two prongs to that. That's like our impression of how old someone is and how our self-impression. The other way to think of this is, like, we actually have two kinds of ages, our chronological age and our biological age. And those can be very different depending on how well or badly you're aging. And this actually turns out to be true for all kinds of model systems as well. Like, you can have even our C. elegans that are going to live three weeks. Some of them die on day 12, some of them die on day 30, right? So it is really those same animals, they're genetically identical, but they're going to have very different fates. There are a lot of tests that are being developed right now to tell, and actually right now on the market, you can send your blood off and someone will tell you your biological age. The problem with those tests right now is that they, if you take them more than once, you'll see there's huge variation. And if you get lucky, you take it once and it gives you the low test score and you stop, right? So those need to get better. Those are based on DNA methylation. And the idea people want to get to is, what is your true biological age? And does that correlate? Are you slowing your aging? And better yet, if it really worked, if I take some sort of intervention, would I see it slow or reverse? Okay, so, but then that's all the biological thing. About the self, now I don't know. You probably know more than I do about that, Reggie.
I think maybe just this might be the last question.
About telomeres,
Mm-hmm.
I don't remember any discussion on that, and I have to get the brain going back to my science, but there was a diagnostic on that, the telomeres.
Yeah. So telomeres is probably, I don't know, is that at the ends of our chromosomes, we have these caps. And the idea is, it's a kind of elegant solution to a biological problem. You can only, replicate DNA, you have to stick something on it and go to the end, but you can't keep doing that if there's nothing to stick to. So the way that chromosomes have solved that, they add on these extra bits that are kind of extra. But with age, every time that gets replicated, there's less and less of it. So that gets into what's called the telomere. So our telomeres get shorter with age. And that's a really super important discovery. Nobel Prize for that. But how well that correlates with age that's still an open question. And the truth is that if it really were the only answer, we've known about this for a long time. We've been able to get that information for a long time. It's just not the only thing going on. And the reason for that makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of cells in our body that never divide. We get one set and it's done. And so if you have a cell that never divides, it doesn't matter what the telomere situation is. All right? And so we're made up of a mix of both cells. And so the telomere, it's important for dividing cells, and that's why you can't divide cells forever, because they get too short. But it's not the only thing that's going wrong. And in fact, the people have done crazy things to try to get more of them by putting in something called TERT1. It's very strange because there hasn't been a difference. So I think it's not, people were excited about it. It's not the whole story. It may be some part of it.
Right, so for example, neurons don't divide, and yet we cognitively age.
Exactly.
So there's something else going on in our neurons
Right.
in our brains besides that.
That's right.
So
cells that divide need them, and other cells.
back to your conductor analogy, it's one player in the orchestra.
That's right.
Right. Okay, well this has been really terrific. I thank you, Coleen Murphy, author of How We Age, The Science of Longevity. Let's thank Coleen very much, and thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Professor Wang and Professor Murphy, for being here. This was a great talk, really fascinating, and we look forward to more events, both with the Princeton University Press and with Labyrinth Books. We have a very full season coming up ahead, and now to the book signing. And thank you, everybody, for coming out tonight.
Lots of books.